Syllables, syllable structure, consonant clusters. Typologically, among the languages of the world, English is fairly unusual in the multiplicity of the consonant clusters which it allows. There are many languages that have consonant clusters, but they don't usually have such complex clusters as English does. And they don't usually allow them to be so complicated at the end of a syllable or at the end of a word as English does. So because English is out of line in this respect, it offers a problem to many learners. We discussed yesterday all the various individual consonants, and we saw the necessity of producing them not only at the beginning but also at the end of a word or syllable. Well, this is true, as we say, true in spades, true also of the clusters. The general formula for the structure of an English syllable is given as 1 on the handout, where you could see that we can have anything from 0 to 3 initial consonants, and anything from 0 to, well, it's a good question, at least 4 possible final consonants. It's a bit difficult to delimit the constraints on final consonants, really because of morphology. Because anything that is a plausible stem can add something to make it into a plural, if it's a noun, or a third singular if it's a verb, or into a past tense if it's a verb. So it really depends upon our ingenuity in recognizing complicated stems. I mean, just let me show you the kind of thing I mean. Supposing I have a pie or a cake, and I cut it into 2 pieces. These 2 pieces are called halves. We can use the verb to halve, and I can say that after I've done it, I've halved it. Okay, that's not very interesting. But supposing I cut it into 5 pieces, each of which is a fifth, and together they constitute 5 fifths. And it's always open to me in English to innovate by creating a verb to say that what I was doing was fifthing it, halving it, quartering it, why not, fifthing it, and that when I finish doing it, I have fifthed it. But then I've got 2 cakes. One of them I have fifthed, and the other one I haven't. I've got 10 cakes. 5 of them have been fifthed, and 5 haven't, so I divide them into the fifths and the unfifths. This is what I mean by saying it's open-ended. In this way I'm producing new final consonant clusters, which otherwise we wouldn't probably have recognized as possible. Well, that's all very fun and so on, but not very practical. Let's now have a look at the range of types of consonant cluster that English allows. First of all, initial consonant clusters. And we can see the overhead projection, clusters. The general types of initial consonant cluster we have. First of all, we can have most consonants followed by a liquid. So I've got some examples here with B. We can make bl in blue, br in brown, and a rarer type we can have sh with R, for example, in shrink. These may offer a certain problem to some learners, the temptation typically being to not make them close enough together, therefore to allow something in and say blue or brown rather than blue, brown. Notice that the tongue is always ready for the L or the R well before the lips separate from the B, blue, brown. English children, to begin with, often say things like blue, but as they get bigger, they do it properly as blue. Then we've got clusters with y and w. Well, there are certain constraints upon this, but most consonants can form a cluster with a yod, as M and yod in music, and many of them with W, as th and w in thwart to thwart. So that gives us two general patterns. I've only chosen a few examples there, but we can exemplify most of them. The other type of general pattern that we have is S plus something. So S plus M, for example, in smile, S plus plosive in spoon or steep or scared. These offer a different kind of problem to learners. Well, some learners treat them the same way and want to say smile, spoon, steep, and so on. To get rid of that transition, steep, make it steep, spoon, make it spoon, smile, make it smile. The other problem is what's known as a prophetic vowel, which is what Spanish speakers tend to do, to put a vowel in front of this cluster so as to divide it between two syllables as a spoon, a steep. That obviously requires practice. To get rid of that extra vowel, a steep becomes steep. And you must not even think of a vowel there, you must just begin the word with steep, steep. So not I come from Spain, but I come from Spain. From Spain, it follows immediately on the preceding word, Spain. All right, two general patterns, consonant plus liquid or semivowel, and S plus a consonant. We also have three consonant clusters, initially, and they always constitute, well, some kind of combination of these two. They begin with an S, and then they have one of the other possibilities that we've already discussed. So we get, for example, S and pl as in split, S and tr as in straight, S and ky as in skew, S and qu as in squeeze. And they're subject to both of the same kinds of problem. Difficulty in getting the consonants close enough together. You have to say split and not split. Split, always one consonant, that's one syllable. Equally, you mustn't put a pathetic vowel before it. You must say a split instead of split. Some people, particularly East Europeans, have problems with V versus W. And this extends to clusters as well, so you tend to get things like squeeze instead of squeeze. Particularly Hungarians seem to find this very difficult to avoid. Fort, twin instead of twin. Well, remember all the points we discussed yesterday about the differences between V and W. W is made with the lips and the back of the tongue, doesn't involve the teeth, doesn't have any friction. So that applies equally in squeeze. All right, let's move now on to final consonant clusters. They are really very much more complicated in English, and there are various different ways in which you can classify them. I thought it was helpful, first of all, to consider those that have a voiceless consonant preceded by a nasal or a liquid. So these are things like MP in lamp, N plus K in think, L plus T in belt, N plus T in month. There are two kinds of typical error here, of which one is particularly important, and the one that's particularly important is the error of omitting the final consonant. You mustn't say lamb instead of lamp, because lamb means something else, namely a baby sheep. You mustn't say I think instead of I think, because thing means object. This is perhaps not such a problem when we say the word in isolation, but it is a problem in connected speech. And these final consonants in this first block really should remain in connected speech. So a typical error is to say, I think they're wrong, instead of, I think they're wrong, In other words, omitting the K in think. I think there must be a bit of voicelessness at the end of that. Not I think that it's right, but I think that it's right. Apart from that, in general, these are relatively easy final consonant clusters. You will sometimes hear slight differences among native speakers. For example, in the word month, you may sometimes hear people pronounce it with a plosive between the N and the th, that is saying month, month, rather than month. Well, this is good news because it means that you can do that if it's easier, but you don't have to if it isn't easier. So sometimes people pronounce month. If we take another example, if we take, for example, fence, we have the same option there, although the dictionary will usually tell you that it should be pronounced fence, 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 to put a fence under around your property. Many speakers insert an epithetic plosive between the N and the S and call it a fence, a fence of the property. Doesn't matter at all which you do, whichever is easier. Next block of final consonants, final consonant clusters, consist of an S or an F, voice fricative, plus a plosive. So we've got things like a wasp, to write at a desk, and something that's soft. Are these easy to make for everybody? I think relatively so, certainly easier than the initial corresponding clusters. Native speakers sometimes, in various non-standard forms of English, change the order of the consonants, a phenomenon known as metathesis. So instead of wasp, there are country pronunciations, rural pronunciations like wops. And certain West Indians say dex instead of desk. And most noticeably, arcs rather than ask. I don't know if you've ever heard the pronunciation arcs for ask. It has a long history in English. It's recorded over 1,000 years that it's been there alongside the standard ask. In recent years, it's come to be seen as a kind of trademark of West Indian identity. Jamaicans normally say arcs, and their sons and daughters who have grown up in London very often retain this in the midst of an otherwise Cockney kind of pronunciation. You nevertheless hear them saying to ask somebody a question rather than to ask a question. So that's an interesting fact, historic fact. We then have a number. Have you found the error on the handout yet? The next line after metathesis, it reads voiceless, see the consonant plus S, and it should be voiced consonant, of course, plus Z. Because, except after sibilants, we make plurals by adding S after voiceless, Z after voiced. Here's examples. More than one cop makes cops. Notice that there's no difference in pronunciation between the two words cops, police, plural, and cops, kind of wood, small wood, where it's a single morpheme. As far as we know, speakers don't ever make any difference between them. It's a bit difficult to be absolutely firm and say no speaker ever makes a difference. There is a kind of hypothesis around that you can signal this difference by slowing down so that if you say cops, it's more likely to be the first than the second. I'm not sure that I believe this, and I don't think anybody's ever proved it. Likewise, between tax, when you pay your tax, and tax, little nails, ways in which a sailing boat moves forward, normally pronounced identically. Thanks. We also get this, for example, after voices fricative, F in cliff, giving cliffs. Now what you notice here is that a number of clusters which have to exist because of allowing plurals also exist for words that are morphologically solid, that have no morpheme boundary within them. So because we need PS for things like cops and stops and tops and lips, we can also use it in a relatively small number of words like cops and laps, elapse and so on, ellipse, in which it's not a plural. Very strikingly so with x, because we need it for plurals, singulars, but we've also got lots of words like six and box and fix and so on, and make use of this. But we see this again a lot. Some of the other clusters we get, though, more or less only arise by adding a suffix. So there are no simple stems that end in F plus S, only plurals, cliffs, and so on. Likewise, we've got N plus Z, voice consonants plus Z, line gives us lines. Are there any solid, morphologically solid words that end in n's? Can you think of one, anybody? Well, there are two. In fact, one is lens, and the other is cleanse, clean. But because we have to have n's, you can see how we can accommodate those. Z, well, in beds, plural's bed, and there is one rather rare word, an instrument used by carpenters called an adze, which does give us a different word. Well, these, of course, are irregular plurals, but they're all irregular in the same way. Knife ends in a voiceless fricative. Now, this one is shown in the spelling, so everybody knows about knife, knives. And you can see that what happens here is instead of the expected knifes, compare cliff, cliffs, we have an irregularity of switching from voiceless to voiced. Knives. The knives are out. As you know, there are several other words that have the same irregularity. But my point now is that there are others again that do exactly the same irregular plural, but it's not shown in the spelling. And this is true of mouth, voiceless in the singular, but mouths voiced in the plural. Mouths. Can you suggest any other examples that have that same irregularity with TH sounds? Mouth, voiceless in the singular. Life, lives, that's the evidental, yes. What about TH ones though? Yeah. Cloth, no. The plural of cloth is cloths, usually. We have this other word, clothes, with a different vowel, and as far as present day English is concerned, cloth and clothes have lost touch with one another. What are we going to offer? A thief, thieves, yes. You all know about those that come in the spelling, don't you? But nobody's offered me one with TH.
Moth?
Moth? No, moth is regular. Moths. Isn't it difficult? Well, it's a bit uncertain. Life, lives, yes, that's an F1 though. Yes. Thank you. Bath, baths. See, we have to fall back on a native speaker. No, teeth is irregular in a different way, isn't it? Tooth, teeth. Bath. To go and have a bath. I have a bath every day. How many baths do you have a week? Well, that's certainly what I would do. But I carried out an opinion poll where people had to say what their plural of bath was, and only about 50% of them gave that answer. Some people, furthermore, made a difference between having 20 baths a month, on one hand, voiceless, and going to the public baths for a swim, on the other hand, voiced. So it looks, in fact, as if these words are gradually becoming regular. No doubt because it isn't shown in the spelling. Again, if you ask me what the plural of youth is, 3 young men, 3 youths, I would say, or voiced. But I quite often hear people saying 3 youths. The American Declaration of whatever it is, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, every now and again I hear Americans holding truths to be self-evident. So this irregularity that is not shown in the spelling, perhaps, I say, is gradually disappearing from the language. The advantage, of course, with life, lives, knife, knives, and so on, is that that one is shown in the spelling and that keeps it constant, which doesn't stop various Scottish and other people sometimes saying wifes rather than wives. Same is true also of the last one here. Singular house, voiceless. You would predict, therefore, a plural houses, but no, most of us say houses with the voice instead of houses. Houses. And that, too, therefore, is irregular. That's the only one with S and Z start. Again, not shown in the spelling, and there are Scottish and other people who sometimes say houses, but not in mainstream accents. Well, then we have a whole lot involving T or D. Because, again, of the suffix effect, voiceless consonants add T, unless they are already a T. Voiced consonants add D, unless they're already a D. And yes, the same thing applies. We need these for the morphology, so we can tolerate them for all sorts of solid words. Past tense of whip is whipped, so we need PT for script, but we got it for script. Tact, diplomacy, and tact, backwards and forwards, pronounced the same way, both of them tact. Sniffed, we need FT for sniffed, so we can use it for soft and left, and so on. Touch gives us touched. I think that one's found only because of suffixation. There are no stems attached. Where the stem is voiced, we add D, so hum gives us hummed. I hummed a tune. Band, single morpheme, band, past tense of band, pronounced the same, normally, I believe. Likewise, build, single word, and build, past tense of to build somebody, both pronounced the same, build. Past tense of to ring something around is ringed, ringed around. Past tense of judge, judged. Past tense of stabbed, stabbed. Now all of those occur only as suffixes. Suffix forms. Some of these, you will notice, involve sequences of plosives. PT script, KT tact, BD stabbed, also to bag something, past tense bagged. And these sequences of plosives demand a little bit of attention, which we shall look at later on when we talk about plosive releases. The point is that you don't usually hear the noise of the release of the first plosive. We don't normally say script, though I might, if I was speaking very clearly so you could hear it. More usually is script, script. I don't usually say tact. I usually say tact, and you can't really hear the release of the k, tact. I don't usually say stabbed. I usually pronounce stab. It's a little bit difficult demonstrating this in a big audience here because one of the characteristics of the style we use for speaking to a large audience is precisely to explode these consonants, but in ordinary conversation we don't do it. Okay, let's move on and look at the bits and pieces we haven't yet covered. We've covered most of the types of final consonants, but another morpheme, another ending suffix that we have with a variety of meanings, some of them rather fossilized, is the TH ending. And we have this, of course, for when we say 4 and 4th, to make an ordinal number, C at 16. But we also to have it for these abstract nouns. Long gives us length, broad gives us breadth, wide gives us width, and this gives us unfamiliar final clusters. Width. Most people, I think, say it as width, with starting voiced but then going voiceless, width, although some people assimilate it and make the whole thing voiceless, width. And those who basically say width can also pronounce it with a glottal stop, thus width. So several possibilities there. And then there are things involving an L or a nasal plus a voiced consonant, one of those we haven't yet discussed, giving us bulb, for example, indulge, strange, and so on. That really is the end of the possible 2 consonant clusters, but we then come on to these 3 consonant clusters, exemplified at the bottom. Again, if we've got a verb to fix, we need a past tense fixed, so we can tolerate xt, so we can use it for things like next or text. Because we've got text, we can make a plural, texts. We have things like to thank, therefore we can have a past tense thanked, plural thanks. Therefore we have 1 or 2 words like jinx. We have hand, so we can do a plural hands. But these final clusters are fairly complex by any standards. So it's not surprising that native speakers quite often reduce them in some sense, get rid of part of them. And I think it's helpful for all of you to know what the possible reductions are, precisely because if native speakers can get rid of them, and your learners find them difficult to imitate, well then they need to know what they can safely omit and what they can't. So here in italics, sloping writing, are the phonetic symbols for consonants that can be omitted when these words are said in isolation, rather than studying various medieval texts. It's quite okay to speak of medieval texts. We get a rather long S at the end, texts, but you don't actually necessarily have a plosive between them, texts. I think the distinction between singular and plural is maintained. Texts, different from text. But you get this long S thing. People sometimes do this with other clusters, wasps. You sometimes get things like wasps. But you tend to get a bit of a labial gesture, wasps. Wasp. I don't think it's entirely removed. Likewise, desks. Desks sometimes sounds as if the K is entirely gone. I don't know whether it really is. Certainly past tense of asked very often loses its K, giving you asked. And the third singular, he asks a question, can give you he asks a question. Thanked can be thanked. Hands can be hand. So this means, for example, that although we insist that the Japanese must make a difference between rows, plural of row, and roads, plural of road, Japanese learners find it a difficult distinction, after N, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you say hands rather than hands. All of that is in isolation. When the word is in connected speech and followed by something in the next word, then a whole further possible set of reductions apply, elisions, which Mr. Windsor-Lewis will talk to you about next week. Time to move on now from considering what the clusters are. Question, yes?
What do you do with bit or melt words like, because we said L plus D, okay?
Yes.
But what about bit as or a word like melt?
Melt. Past tense is melted. After T or D, you have to add a
I was
noun.
thinking of the association L plus D.
All right. Hold.
Bit and melt.
Well, L plus D arises from a verb like fill, if you filled, and then it's voiced, you see. Build is irregular in that it changes the syllable.
So you have LT.
Well, we do have LT anyhow, words like belt. That's one of the earliest group, nasal or liquid plus voiceless consonant. So I included those there. I think I've,
Sorry,
there are different ways of presenting these things, and people draw up different kinds of rules for phonotactics as to what's possible. This is what I thought is a pedagogically useful way of doing it, at any rate, because the difficulties that particular language groups have can be classified helpfully as well. Yeah, one of the big problems with doing any kind of lecture of this type or writing a textbook is that what is of vital importance to one group is obvious and trivial to another group. So, I'm sorry about that, there's no way around it. I have great hopes that soon we shall be able to write wonderful hypertext documents which will enable you to home in on the areas that are of interest to your particular group while ignoring the areas that are not. So the Japanese can have great chapters about L and R, and the Spanish can ignore them. And the Spanish can have lots and lots about D and the, which, again, other people can ignore. That's in the glorious future, though, at the moment. As soon as I've written it all, it will be available on CD-ROM and you can read it on your computer. All right, let's move on now and talk about L sounds. Clear and dark L. I think you probably have all heard about this point, that the L phoneme in standard accents has two rather different qualities depending upon its position with respect to other sounds. Namely, we have a clear variety, generally similar to I in its colour. This is used before a vowel sound or before a yod. So if I say let, you can hear that L is fairly clear. The point is I don't say let, but let. In received pronunciation and similar accents, we do this before any kind of vowel, including back vowels. So I say look, and not look. Look would be a Bulgarian or whatever mispronunciation. It's look with a clear L. Likewise, allow, not allow. And follow, not follow. All right, so when there's a vowel after it, we get a clear L. However, when there isn't a vowel after it, then we get a dark L, which is coloured like sort of or. So, before a consonant in milk, I don't say milk, but milk. I don't say shelf, but shelf. I don't say troubled, but troubled. In each case, we've got a consonant following. Now, you can practice making different kinds of L if you just have a kind of game. Remember, L involves tongue tip on alveolar ridge, air coming out round the sides. But holding all that constant, if you experiment with the back of the tongue, you can do all sorts of other things. You can make any kind of vowel colour at the same time as L. So what you must choose is a kind of air colouring, for a clear L, and a kind of or colouring, for a dark L, and that gives you the two we want, let, tell. Now, if the general rule is clear L before a vowel, dark L elsewhere, we have to face the question of, again, what are we talking about? Are we talking about words? Are we talking about syllables? Are we talking about something else? Look what happens when we add a suffix. If we take the verb to fill on its own, that has a dark L at the end, because it's not followed by a vowel if I just say fill by itself. But as soon as I add in filling it up, notice the L is then clear, filling it up. This also applies if we have a pronoun object, it. Fill it. What shall I do with it? Fill it. What shall I do with this book? Sell it. I'm going to sell, dark L, sell it, clear L. So this is something that is not blocked by a syllable boundary or the kind of word boundary that we have between a verb and it. So far, I think this is fairly uncontroversial. But beyond that, you will find the textbooks are silent, misleading, or in many cases, in my view, wrong. What do we do with a word like table? In isolation, dark L, table. Plural, tables. Z there, consonant, means it's got to be dark. But if I draw up a table of contents for a document, that's what I call it, a table of contents. Can I slow that down? A table of contents, a table of contents. And I think I'm not unusual in using a clear L before a vowel as long as it's closely linked into it. Now that fact is not clearly represented in our standard textbooks. They sort of talk about dark L at the end of a word, or because it's a syllabic L, it's dark. I think syllabicity has nothing to do with it. Syllabicity is one matter, clear and dark is a different matter. Syllabic L, all right, it's dark, it's a table, and it's clear if you have a vowel following its table of contents. That's again a close-knit phrase, table of contents.
Could I make a little comment, John?
Please.
What I think is interesting about, you said it's nothing to do with syllabicity. Well, target, yeah. You say it's nothing to do with syllabicity. I think perhaps it is in some way, because I think what I usually do in table of contents is I desyllabify the L.
Thank you. This belongs in my next week's lecture called Compression. And Jack's exactly right, entirely right. We can lose a syllabicity and say table of contents, and everybody agrees there that it's a clear L. What we haven't yet really faced, though, is the question of bigger boundaries than that between table and of. What's wrong? Oh, I feel ill. I feel ill. I think I'd use a clear L there. I feel ill. But you will hear people say, I feel ill, with a dark L. That's a bit of a bigger boundary, isn't it? Now, for example, if I want to mention something else, for example, if I... Do I say, for example, if I want to... What do I say, for example, if I... That boundary, which could be a comma in writing, of course, and is typically an intonation break, that triggers dark L. Certainly, sentence boundary, in most cases clause boundary, often phrase boundary, are sufficient to trigger a dark L before. But it's these close-knit phrases where we don't have a boundary that, in my view, normally have clear L, and that's not shown in the text. Well, that's quite enough on L's. Let's move on to plosives, otherwise we shan't get through that at all. Plosives. We can identify always 3 stages in a plosive as the organs of speech come together, stay together, and separate. One after the other. These 3 stages have a number of different names in different authors, different textbooks. I shall call them the approach, the hold, and the release. As we saw before, a P sound, like in happy, really is just a momentary silence, because during the hold, you can hear nothing. Happy. So you can see that logically, you must identify it when you hear it by listening to the approach and listening to the release. And that comes out very clearly on a spectrogram, if I were to put a spectrogram in front of you. There's an effect at the end of the vowel as the lips move together, and then another effect at the beginning of the next vowel as the lips separate. That's how we know it's a P, not a T, not a K, all of which consists of voicelessness. Nevertheless, we've got 2 places at which we can identify its place of articulation, at the beginning and at the end, in the approach and in the release. And it's clear that we don't really need both of these things. This is why in these words like captain that we were looking at, transcribe it up here, captain, we've got 2 separate plosives. first one is bilabial, the second one is alveolar. And typically, the approach for the second one takes place during the whole of the first one. The release of the first one takes place during the whole of the second one, and therefore you can't hear it. And all you can hear is an approach for a P, cap, and a release for a T. Captain, captain, doctor, doctor. This is this release masking that I'm talking about. Your practical class teacher will perhaps discuss it further with you if appropriate. It's one, therefore, of the special releases, others of which are listed on the handout. Well, I won't go through these in detail because there isn't time, but you'll notice that we can classify these various approaches and releases. If you've got a word like amber, the B there, what kind of an approach does it have? Well, it doesn't need the lips to move because the lips are already put together for the M. So the crucial change as we go from M to B in amber is that of the soft palate. That's no problem. Everybody, I think, can say that without any difficulty. The problem comes when they're in the other order. In a word like submit, where you can see this as release on the plosive, nasal release. Now, what you do in submit is just the same as what you do in amber, but in the other order. So you just think about it logically, it ought to be equally easy. It isn't. Many people have difficulty pronouncing sequences like the N in submit, or the N's in kidney. Kidney should be like under, but the other way around. The end of section 5 on the handout, gemination, words like background, where you've got two plosives with the same place of articulation, bedtime, soup plate. Of course, what we normally do is we run them together to make a single long plosive of the kind that comes in Italian or in Japanese. We don't normally say background or bedtime. We say background, bedtime. Now, when that happens, 6 on the handout, and the first plosive is voiceless, sometimes native speakers use a glottal stop instead and say night, nighttime, nighttime, background, bookcase, soup plate. You don't have to imitate that, but you can if you're Cantonese and it's easier. But if you're not Cantonese and it isn't easier, there's no particular reason to do so. Some other glottal stops, which I'll talk about more next week, other positions where T in particular tends to be pronounced glottal nowadays, words like atmosphere rather than atmosphere, button rather than button, football rather than football, and indeed things like it's not yet right, it's not yet right. Perhaps that's overdoing it a bit, but it's not yet right is perfectly normal. You can't do this if the preceding segment is an obstruent. You can't make a glottal stop in a phrase like test me. You can't say test me. What you can do is omit it and say test me. The very last point I want to urge on you is please, in ear training and elsewhere, be aware of the difference between 0 on the one hand and glottal stop on the other hand. They're very different things linguistically, even though you can't hear either of them because you can't hear anything that's voiceless and plosive. Nevertheless, there is a crucial difference between where there is something happening between the vowels, and where there is nothing happening between the vowels. Okay, that's it this morning.